In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to adjust the pivot point of our objects. Okay, so in this scene I have just a very simple demonstration object set up here, and we'll use this as a way of actually seeing how we can start to adjust the pivot point or the center point of our Softimage objects. So we have a situation where we have this little clock here, and if I were to select this, what we would normally want is for these clock hands to rotate around this center part of the clock. Well, in some situations, whenever you model out a piece of geometry, your center may not always wind up exactly where it's needed for animation purposes. So we have to come in and actually manually move that point of rotation. So you can see if I were to select this object, press the C key on my keyboard, and try to rotate this around, that this clock hand obviously is not rotating around the proper area. So within Softimage, there are a couple of different ways of actually moving our center point. So one method is to actually press and hold the Alt key on your keyboard, and you'll notice when I press and hold my Alt key that my manipulator here changes from this rotation ring to now more of just these straight lines. So if I were to jump to my top view, this will be a little bit easier to actually do this. If I press and hold the Alt key on my keyboard, I can now click and drag my center point. And as soon as I let off, now you can see my rotation is been moved. Now, here's the thing to remember about this. If I use this method of pressing and holding my Alt key to move my center point, this is really only a temporary movement. So, yes, now you can see if I move this hand around, that it does rotate around the proper area, but watch what happens if I deselect my object. So if I select it and then reselect it again, you can see my center point has moved back to its original position. So pressing and holding the Alt key to move your pivot point is a great way to do this if maybe you just temporarily need to rotate and move your object without permanently altering its point of rotation. Now, what if we actually wanted to permanently change that center of our object? Well, if we come up to this upper area of our selection, right now we are set to an object mode, but what we can actually do is set this to a center mode. Now, if we click on this, we can actually pick up our center and move it around. Now, depending on which tool we have selected, or which of these transform tools we have active, you can see in my case we are using rotation, which means I'm actually going to be rotating my center point. We don't want to do that just yet. So for now, let's press the V key on our keyboard. And again, still making sure that we're in the center mode. We should be able to come in and grab the center and move it to where we want. Now, as soon as we're done making this alteration, we can go back to object mode, and what we should be able to see is, once again, if I press the C key on my keyboard, that my object is rotating around this correct area. But the difference is that now if I deselect my object and reselect it again, you notice that the center is still in that same area that we moved it to. So by using this method, we have permanently changed the point of rotation for this object. Now, another thing to keep in mind whenever it comes to actually moving your center points is that it actually does make a difference which one of these transform modes we have active. So for example, if I jump to, again, center mode and press the V key on my keyboard to switch to my translate tool, at the moment we have this set to a local mode, which means it is actually moving my center along this object's local orientation. You can see that that is sliding right along that direction of our hand, of this clock hand. Now, if I were to set this to a global mode, watch what happens. You can see now my manipulator has changed, and instead of moving that in some kind of a local orientation, you can see now it's really moving it right along the scene X, Y, and Z coordinates. So again, it makes a very big difference as far as our actual outcome, which of these modes we have active. Now, in addition to just being able to move our center point around, we can actually alter the rotation or the orientation of our center point as well. So, for example, if I were to select this second clock hand down here, and once again, make sure I'm in center mode, press the V key on my keyboard, you can see that if I jump to a local mode, with this particular object, it is not oriented properly. So even if I switch it to a local mode, you can see that the manipulator handles don't point in the correct direction. So if I wanted to, I could actually change not only the position, but also the orientation. So if I were to, again with this center mode active, press the C key on my keyboard to jump to my rotate tool. This will be a little bit easier to see if I jump to my top view. I can now come in and just simply rotate my center until it is pointed properly. And then once I'm finished, I can go back to an object mode. And now once again, if I press the V key on my keyboard to switch to my translate tool, with this set to local mode, now it's pointing in the proper area or the proper direction. So again, go back to center mode, move my center to where I want it, and then go back to object mode. Very nice. So one last thing that I want to show you before we wrap up this lesson is the fact that we can actually very quickly snap our center point to a certain area or certain components. Now we'll talk a little bit more about components when we get into our modeling section, but for now, what we can actually do is if we were to go in and select, let's say, a set of points on our piece of geometry, let's say I wanted my center to be exactly at the point where this little blue dot is. So if I were to select this right here, let's make sure we are actually in a point selection mode. And try that again, tap my space bar, go back to point mode, there we are. So now I can come in and select just this one little blue dot, this point, and now with this selected, go to my transform, and down toward the bottom we have an option that says we can move the center of this object to the selected vertices. So now if I click on that, and then once again quickly tap my spacebar or go back into object mode, and now hit the C key on my keyboard, you can see that my pivot point, or my center, has been moved to that exact area that we had selected. And like I said, we'll actually talk in a great amount of detail about these actual component modes and what these actually mean and what those do. So once we get into our modeling section, we'll talk about those, like I said, in a lot more detail. So for now, that's a look at how we can start to come in and both temporarily and permanently alter the points of rotation for our various pieces of geometry.